Carol in 1843. So that's how good a story this is, and it still holds up. And this is an adapted version of it. I've shortened it up quite a bit from Charles. If you've read Dickens, you know he likes words. He likes words. I love words too, but I don't want you to go to sleep, so we try to keep it moving right along. They had been partners, Scrooge and Marley, but now Marley was dead. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole friend, and sole mourner. Yet even Scrooge was not much affected by it. But he had never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood above the warehouse door these 7 years after. Scrooge and Marley. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, grasping, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck generous fire. Now, once upon a time, and of all days of the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather. The door of Scrooge's office was open that he might keep an eye on his clerk, who was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it might have only been one coal. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle, God save you!" Scrooge's nephew Fred had entered so quickly that Scrooge hadn't even noticed his arrival. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Oh, come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What reason have you to be dismal? You're rich enough." "Bah! Humbug! Don't be cross, Uncle. What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas? What's Merry Christmas time to you? At a time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips would be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. I have always thought of Christmas time as a kind, forgiving, charitable time, and therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and I say God bless it. Come, dine with us tomorrow." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I will keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle, and Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room and stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge. "My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas." The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, who now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley died 7 years ago this very night," said Scrooge. "Well then, Mr. Scrooge, at this festive season, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons." "And the workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are," returned the gentleman, though I wish I could say they were not. "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course." "A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," replied Scrooge. You wish to remain anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen. The gentlemen withdrew, and Scrooge resumed his labors. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. Scrooge dismounted from his stool. His clerk instantly snuffed his candle out. You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose, said Scrooge. If quite convenient, sir. It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to dock you half a crown for it, I'd think you'd find yourself rather ill-used, eh? And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work. It's only once a year, sir. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. Be here all the earlier next morning, Cratchit. Scrooge walked out with a growl. He took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern and went home to his gloomy suite of rooms in a glowering pile of a building up a dark lane. Now, it is a fact that Scrooge had seen the knocker on his door, night and morning, for many years. But on this night, having his key in the lock, Scrooge saw the knocker not as a knocker, but as Marley's face. It stared at him as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead with a sense of horror. As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it became a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he turned the key, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first. But there was nothing out of place, so he closed it with a bang. He fastened the lock and walked up the stairs, not caring a button for the darkness around him. Darkness was cheap, and Scrooge liked it all the more for that. But before he locked the heavy door to his rooms, he walked through them to be sure that all was right. Satisfied, he locked himself in, double locked himself in. He put on his dressing gown, slippers, and nightcap, and sat down before the fire. Humbug, said Scrooge. Suddenly, he was seized by dread as he heard a clanking noise, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain. The noise grew much louder on the floors below. Then it was coming up the stairs, coming straight towards his rooms. It soon passed through the heavy double-locked door, appearing frighteningly before his eyes. It was Marley. A long chain was clasped about his middle and wound about him. It was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, and ledgers wrought in steel. What do you want with me? Said Scrooge. Much. It was Marley's voice, no doubt about it. Who are you? In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Now, I don't believe you, said Scrooge. You are a slight disorder of the stomach. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. At this point, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge fell upon his knees. Mercy, he cried, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? It is required of every man, the ghost moaned, that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turn to happiness. are you fettered? Asked Scrooge, trembling. I wear the chain I forged in life, groaned the ghost. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. Jacob Marley, speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our counting house, and weary journeys lie before me. Oh, captive bound! No space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob. Business! Mankind was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. Hear me. My time is nearly gone. I am here tonight to warn you, Ebenezer, that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I dread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob? Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. Then Marley's ghost held its hand up. The window opened, and Scrooge heard confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret. The spectre joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge moved to the window and looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Scrooge closed the window. He examined the door by which the ghost had entered. The bolts were undisturbed. Hum! Hum! But the word stuck in his throat. He lay down upon his bed and fell asleep upon the instant. Scrooge awoke to the chimes of a neighboring church. The hour bell sounded with a deep, dull, melancholy 1. Light flashed up upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a hand, and Scrooge found himself face to face with an unearthly visitor. It was a strange figure, viewed as through some supernatural medium. Its long hair was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light by which all this was visible. Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold me? Scrooge stammered. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge. No. You were past. The spirit put out its hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road. The city had entirely vanished. It was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was a boy here. Scrooge was conscious of 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. These are but the shadows of the things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consciousness of us. They came to a schoolhouse. No sounds came from within. It is not quite deserted, said the ghost. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. A door opened before them and disclosed a lonely boy reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge wept to see his poor, forgotten self. A little girl much younger than the boy came darting in. She threw her arms about his neck. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother. We'll be together all Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." She stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door. "Always a delicate creature," said the ghost, "but she had a large heart." "So she had," said Scrooge. "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had one child, your nephew Fred." At that moment, they left the school behind them and were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it," said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." They went in. At sight of an old gentleman sitting behind a high desk, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart! It's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock. He rubbed his hands and called out in a comfortable, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. Dear, dear." "No more work tonight," said Fezziwig. "Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here." They cleared away the desks. The floor was swept, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse became as snug and warm and bright as a ballroom. In came a fiddler with a music book. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the three Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came all the young men and women employed in the business, with cake and a great piece of cold roast and mince pies and plenty of beer. In they all came, one after another, and away they all went, 20 couples at once, dancing round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. When this domestic ball broke up, Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, which wished each and every one of them a Merry Christmas. The cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under the counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge's heart and soul were in the scene. He remembered everything, enjoyed everything. It was not until now that he remembered the ghost and became conscious that it was looking full upon him. The Spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig. "Dear old Fezziwig," gushed the young Scrooge. "He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome. It only cost him a few shillings, but the happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." Old Scrooge felt the Spirit's glance. They again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the Spirit. "Quick!" Again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in his eyes, which showed the passion that had taken root. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in whose eyes there were tears. "A golden idol has displaced me," she said. "I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you." "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so. You were not then what you are now. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought release? In words, no. But in a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. May you be happy in the life you have chosen." She moved away, then turned to look back at him. But when he continued only to sit there and did not return her gaze, she left. and he was alone. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "I cannot bear it. Show me no more. Why do you like to torch me?" "These are but the shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "Haunt me no longer." Scrooge was overcome by exhaustion. He realized he was back in his own bedroom. He collapsed into bed and sank into a heavy sleep. When the bell struck 1, Scrooge awakened suddenly, noticing a blaze of ruddy light shining from the adjoining room. He got up softly and shuffled to the door. A strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light. A mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney. There on a couch sat a merry giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch and held it up to shed its light on Scrooge. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me." The giant was clothed in one simple green robe, bordered with white fur, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath. Its dark brown curls were long and free, framing its genial face and its sparkling eyes. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit, rising to its feet. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "conduct me where you will. If you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was bidden. All vanished instantly, and they stood on the threshold of Scrooge's clerk's home. The spirit smiled and blessed Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch. Then uprose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed poorly but brave in ribbons, which made a goodly show, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit and Master Peter Cratchit. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming of the Christmas goose and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. "What's ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day?" "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times. "There's father coming!" cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. In came Bob Cratchit, with his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Martha ran to her father's arms, while the 2 young Cratchits bore Tiny Tim off to hear the plum pudding singing in the copper. "Now did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and Master Peter went to fetch the goose, with which he soon returned. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds. The dishes were set on, grace was said, and when Mrs. Cratchit carved the goose and a gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round, and even Tiny Tim feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth. Bob lifted his glass to them. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved." "No, No, said Scrooge. Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared, if these shadows remain unaltered by the future. None other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head and was overcome with penitence and grief to hear his own words used so. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? Demanded the spirit. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, raising his glass. I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. The founder of the feast indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon. Such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do. My dear, the children, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. You'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The spirit bade Scrooge take hold of his robe again. It was a great surprise to Scrooge to hear a hearty laugh and to recognize it as his own nephew's and to find himself in a bright, gleaming room with the spirit standing smiling by his side. He said that Christmas was a humbug as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew, and he believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. He's a comical old fellow, said Fred. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. But I'll say no more against him. I'm sorry for him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. I mean to give him the same chance to dine with us every year, whether he likes it or not. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? After tea, they had some music, and there was a game of blind man's buff. All 20 people there, young and old, played at it, and so did Scrooge. The ghost was greatly pleased to find Scrooge in this mood, and looked upon him with favor. A new game was declared called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no. The brisk fire of questioning elicited from him that he was thinking of a rather disagreeable animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets. At last, someone cried out, I have found it out! I know what it is, Fred! It's your Uncle Scrooge! Which certainly it was. He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, said Fred, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. To Uncle Scrooge, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. The whole scene passed on, and Scrooge and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. By struggling men, and they were patient. By poverty, and it was rich. In misery's every refuge, the spirit left his blessing. It was a long and strange night, for while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew clearly older. Scrooge noticed that the spirit's hair had turned gray. Are spirits' lives so short? My life upon this globe is very brief, replied the ghost. It ends tonight at midnight. Hark! Time is drawing near. Forgive me, said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? From the folds of its robe, the spirit brought forth 2 children, wretched, frightful, and hideous. They clung upon the outside of its garment. They were a boy and girl, ragged and scowling, wolfish. Scrooge started back, appalled. Spirit, are they yours? They are man's, said the spirit. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written, which is doom, if the writing he erased. Have they no refuge or resource, cried Scrooge? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he beheld a solemn phantom coming like a mist along the ground. The phantom approached, shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? Asked Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. You are about to show me shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time to come. Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company. Lead on, spirit. The phantom moved away, and Scrooge followed in the shadow of its rule. They were in the heart of the city, amongst the merchants who chinked the money in their pockets and conversed in groups and looked at their watches. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. No, said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead. What has he done with his money? Asked a red-faced gentleman. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know, said the man with the chin. It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know of anyone who would go to it. I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, observed the red-faced gentleman. But I must be fed for my trouble. The spirit then led Scrooge into an obscure part of the town. The whole quarter reeked with crime, filth, and misery. In this infamous den, there was a shop where iron, old rags, bottles, and bones were bought. Sitting among the wares he dwelt was a gray-haired rascal, calmly smoking his pipe. Scrooge and the phantom watched as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. She had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black. In seeing each other, they all three burst into a wicked laugh. The charwoman threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool. Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did. That's true indeed, said the laundress. No man more so. Who's the wiser? If he'd been natural in his lifetime, he'd have had someone to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there alone by himself. It's a judgment on him, said the charwoman. And it would have been a heavier judgment if I could have laid my hands on anything else. The undertaker's man in faded black stepped up to produce his plunder. It was examined and appraised by old Joe. The laundress was next. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe unfastened a great many knots and dragged out a large and heavy roll of dark fabric. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took them down, rings and all, with them lying there? Yes, I do, and why not, eh? And you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had. They'd have wasted it by putting it on him to be buried in if it hadn't been for me. I took it right off him. Scrooge recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. A pale light fell upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Spirit, said Scrooge, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let me see some tenderness connected with the death, or this dark chamber will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house and found the mother and the children seated round the fire, quiet, very quiet. The mother put her hand up to her face. I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time. I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother, answered Peter. They were very quiet again. At last she said, I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. No trouble. Oh, there's your father at the door. She rose to meet him as he entered. They all tried to make him comfortable. The two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if to soothe his sorrow. You went today then, Robert? Said Mrs. Cratchit. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, my Tim. He broke down all at once and went upstairs into the room above. There was a chair set close beside the child's body. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had composed himself, he kissed the little face. Spectre, said Scrooge, trying to hold back his tears. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead. The phantom pointed off. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed. Scrooge advanced towards the grave, trembling. Spirit, said Scrooge, are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave. Scrooge crept towards it, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. He cried upon his knees, Spirit, hear me! I am not the man I was. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Good Spirit, assure me that I yet may change the shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. Oh, tell me I may smudge away the writing on the stone. In his agony, he caught the spectral hand in his, and as he did, the phantom's robe shrank, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. His bedpost. His bed. His room. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. Then the church bells rang out. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head into the clear, bright, jovial, stirring cold. Glorious. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes. Today? Replied the boy. Well, it's Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day, said Scrooge to himself. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Hello, my fine fellow. Do you know the poulterers in the next street at the corner? I should hope I did. An intelligent boy, said Scrooge. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? What? The one as big as me. What a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's hanging there now. Is it, said Scrooge, tossing some coins. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. After he dispatched the poulterer to the Cratchits and recompensed the boy, Scrooge dressed himself all in his best and got out into the streets. The people were pouring forth, and Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you. He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting house the day before. Oh, my dear sir, said Scrooge, quickening his pace. A Merry Christmas to you, sir. Mr. Scrooge? Yes, said Scrooge, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness? Here, Scrooge whispered in his ear. Lord, bless me, my dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please, said Scrooge, not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Bless you, and Merry Christmas. Scrooge turned his steps toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. A young girl answered the door, and Scrooge tiptoed towards the dining room and peeked in. Fred, it's your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in. It is a mercy Fred didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge was at home in 5 minutes. His niece looked just the same as the Spirit had shown him. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. If he could only get there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was the thing he had set his heart on. And he did. The clock struck 9, no Bob. 1:15, no Bob. He was full 18 minutes behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come in. Hello, growled Scrooge. What do you mean by coming here at this time of day? I'm very sorry, sir, said Bob. I am behind my time. You are, repeated Scrooge. Step this way, sir, if you please. It's only once a year, sir, pleaded Bob. It shall not be repeated. Now I'll tell you what, said Scrooge. I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, he continued, leaping from his stool, and therefore, I am about to raise your salary. A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and assist your struggling family, make up the fires, and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city ever knew. He saw no further spirits, but lived so that it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. I have a story on a slightly lighter note. I swear to myself every year, this is the year I'm going to get through it without tears. This is a true story. It took place in 1932 down in Mesa. This is called The Man Who Killed Santa Claus. The sense of despair was palpable at the Mesa Merchants Association. The Great Depression gripped them in financial strangulation. The Roaring '20s had gone out with a snarl, and one need not look far for the proof. The economy had gone to the dogs. Cost of living had gone through the roof. These were dark days for commerce back in 1932. Now the holidays looked dismal, and they didn't know what to do. Customers were scarce as hen's teeth, and with so many bills to be paid, they didn't know if they'd get to hold their annual Christmas parade. But those who thought debts and creditors meant their pageant wasn't meant to be hadn't reckoned on the editor of the Mesa Tribune, tenacious John McPhee. McPhee was a man of spirit, possessed of audacious temerity, and he was determined to see a return to the days of their former prosperity. He wasn't one to be constrained by pessimism and negation, so he racked his wits. He squeezed his brain till he had an inspiration. I've got an idea, a real blast, he told the desperate vendors. It'll be the salvation of our merchant class. It'll motivate those holiday spenders. It'll grab their attention and make a big splash, he told them with conviction. And customers will shower you with Christmas cash. That was a bold prediction. This idea is a purebred, boys. It's not some mongrel runt. Now, you may have doubts, but trust me, friends, I know this dog can hunt. Everyone expects to see Santa Claus at the head of our Christmas procession, but the way that I plan to have him arrive will make a profound impression. He won't show up in a car or a sleigh. He'll fall from the sky like snow. We'll hire a stuntman and an airplane to kick off our Christmas show. Santa drifts down with a silken cloud billowing high above him, waving to the cheering crowd who gathered to show they love him. And then he'll unbuckle his parachute, and as our audience roars, he'll lead the parade right down Main directly to your stores. Well, the merchants were ecstatic. They heartily endorsed the plan. Their support was most emphatic. McPhee was a brilliant man. This skydiving stuntman Santa would have their customers singing, and the music to accompany them would be cash registers ringing. McPhee found a willing stuntman and a contract was arranged, and by the time he'd rented the plane and the suit, everyone's mood had changed. Gone were the former gloom and doom, the sorrow and the grief. Happy days are here again, was everyone's belief. They could hardly wait for Christmas. And God bless us, everyone, those merchants all gave praises for what John McPhee had done. The excitement was quite tangible. You could feel it in the air. And they turned their attention to Yuletide decor and hung their stockings with care. Finally came the glorious morning that they'd all anticipated. And as they gathered at the field on the edge of town, everyone was elated. Children's shining faces, the parents' smiles were beaming. Could this be the happy ending of which they'd all been dreaming? The stores needed a big payday to help meet their bottom line. They'd been nickeled and dimed since Black Monday back in 1929. The pilot, plane, and stuntman had been no small expense, but McPhee knew that turning a profit would require some investments. But as he contemplated how their deficits would shrink, an assistant whispered in his ear, and his spirits began to shrink. They bought into his vision. He'd made them all believe, but now the stuntman that they'd hired was absent without leave. McPhee hadn't thought it was necessary to ask someone to watch him, but now that it was time to start, it looked like they had lost him. And as the merchants surrounded him, McPhee knew at a glance that it had been bad judgment to pay that stuntman in advance. He quickly dispatched a team of elves to track the stuntman down, and as he turned to face the merchants, every one of them wore a frown. Do not despair. Have faith, my friends, he told the dour shopkeepers. We'll find him in some hotel bed. He's one of those late sleepers. For several anxious minutes more, he strove to calm them down till someone muttered, tar and feathers and a rail ride out of town. You made us all sit up and beg with promises of glory, but all that you've delivered is another shaggy dog story. And when McPhee said that cooler heads should not jump to conclusions, they made it clear they'd better hear some plausible solutions. You're not a partner in our sorrow. Your job will still be here tomorrow. Your livelihood's not riding on that flight. But if those customers don't shop our stores, we're the ones who have to close our doors. You're the only one here with no dog in this fight. Now, an editor needs nerves of steel. He has to be thick-skinned. And McPhee just wasn't ready yet to throw that white towel in. Then one of the elves came rushing up, and from his ashen face, McPhee got the sickening feeling he was about to be disgraced. They'd found the wayward stuntman. He hadn't gotten far. He was plastered to a bar stool in a downtown speakeasy bar. He couldn't stand, he couldn't walk, he couldn't even waddle. He'd spent the whole night searching for his courage in a bottle. McPhee could feel the burning stares. Those merchants were seeing red. So using his most persuasive voice, he turned to them and said, I know that things look bad right now, but we'll salvage a victory. One of you will just have to play Santa, so who's it going to be? But a series of flat refusals soon made things very plain. McPhee got them into this mess. He was the one to blame. And because he was responsible for keeping their hopes alive, he'd be the one to make that jump. And they didn't care if he'd survive. We wouldn't have this problem if we'd kept to the status quo, but you went and turned our pageant into a dog and pony show. Now you have to pay the price and practice what you preach. And if you live, from here on out, you'll be kept on a shorter leash. McPhee felt the noose of failure tightening around his throat. Those merchants now were hopping mad, and he was their scapegoat. And although he was a champion of journalistic might and main, he knew he didn't have what it takes to jump from an airplane. But he thought of a way to salvage his plan. He still had one more card, and now he'd have to play it or be hoisted by his own petard. It's always darkest before the dawn, he said, but this is no time for panicking. Just find me another Santa suit and fetch me a department store mannequin. We'll push the dummy out of the plane with a static cord attached to the chute, and then I'll jump up near the place where it lands, dressed in the second suit. Then you set off some fireworks, and you begin to shout, and we'll cover up the dummy and start the parade before they figure it out. Well, the merchants could see that this might be the best chance they would get. The crowd was growing restless, and they'd come too far to quit. Some dashed off to fetch the props and prepare the plane to scramble. All their hopes were riding on this dummy Christmas gamble. And in a little while, the crowd could hear the airplane's engine sputtering, and they began to shout and cheer. Those merchants' hearts were fluttering. The pilot brought the plane down low to give the audience more, and to let them see that jolly old elf waving from the door. They couldn't see the man behind, making the dummy's arm bend, but they could see that long white beard flapping in the wind. And then the emotion of that moment. Those merchants began to bet that they would pull this stunt off after all. This would be the best Christmas yet. And now the pilot started his climb to set up Santa's flight. And the merchants and everyone else in that crowd felt at last things might turn out all right. And as he watched the plane ascend, McPhee sighed with relief. For a little while there, the tension was high, but he'd managed to keep the peace. Those merchants might have growled at him, but they'd rather fuss than fight. They were all in this together, and in the end, their bark was worse than their bite. They'd overcome great obstacles and done their level best. Now push that dummy out of the plane and let gravity do the rest. And as if in answer to his thoughts, the crowd let out a cry, and there was Santa's red-clad form descending from the sky. But as they held their gaze aloft, it didn't take them long to see from the speed he was falling that something was horribly wrong. Terror was a frozen mask on every boy and girl. The chute deployed from out of its pack, but it did not unfurl. Instead of Santa floating down as gently as a feather, it looked as though both man and chute would hit the ground together. They couldn't tear their eyes away. They wished that they were blind as Santa tumbled earthward with that chute trailing behind. What was meant to be inspiring was quickly turning pitiful. The impact that this stunt would have would tragically be literal. And when that mannequin smashed to the ground, the crowd was sickened and silent. They'd come to see something uplifting. What they saw was horrific and violent. Then the silence was suddenly shattered. They gasped, they cried, and they screamed, but McPhee still thought he could convince them that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. He ran out shouting, "Ho, ho, ho!" Well, you couldn't blame him for trying. The parents were hustling their children away. His act they were not buying. The parade went on as scheduled, but it wasn't well attended. The silence in the stores was deafening. A black cloud had descended, and in those lonely, deserted aisles, not a creature nor a customer stirred. The shopkeeper's hopes for recovery have to be deferred. McPhee laid low for several weeks. He didn't try to be chummy. His popularity had plummeted along with that department store dummy. He was persona non grata, a notorious Christmas traitor. He dug himself into a hole as deep as Santa's crater. The quality of dogged tenacity can find a way to spite you. And even if yours is the hand that feeds, don't think that they won't bite you. To bank on seasonal goodwill is an ever-present danger. If expectations aren't fulfilled, you're seen as a dog in the manger. But time, they say, can heal all wounds, and eventually he was forgiven. And the citizens turned their attention back to the tasks of everyday living. But even though the memory faded, whenever Christmas rolled around, McPhee always made up some excuse to get himself out of town. Anyone can fall from grace, and good things can turn rotten, but a really bad impression never gets completely forgotten. McPhee devoted years of service to his community, but this debacle continued to hound him without immunity. No matter how much good he tried to do, wherever he would go, it was always remembered that he was the man who put the missile in mistletoe. It is enough to make one cry, to see one's hopes crushed from on high. And few among us know how bad that feels. But some of us may feel deprived and know what it is to live our lives with regret forever nipping at our heels. One can atone for harebrained schemes and try one's best to please. But if you're going to lie down with dogs, don't be surprised if you get up with fleas. Despite our best intentions, fate can be cruel and mocking. Reputation can come crashing down, and coal can fill one's stocking. They say pride comes before a fall, and disaster awaits the unwary, and fame can turn into infamy, in the words of an obituary. There were many good and charitable works for which he might have been known, but history, it seems, was unwilling to throw McPhee a bone. He thought he'd made a foolproof plan that covered every detail, but emotions are rabid, and it's dog-eat-dog when it comes to Christmas retail. Of all the things to be remembered for, this is not what he would have picked. Some folks say, let sleeping dogs lie. But one resume credit dogged him even after he died. He was the guy who devised the demise of old St. Luke. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas to you all.